Maps are subjective, unless you're talking about an unmounted, unannotated topographic globe. Every map contains bias, which can affect how the viewer perceives the world. These biases could lie in the map's projection, which way is up, what's in its center, even the language used in its labels. It follows that when you give a map of your setting to your players, certain decisions made while designing it will affect how they see your world. So, when we give a map to our table, what do we want it to say? Welcome back to World Building Praxis, where we are building a world from scratch for use as a D&D campaign setting. Last time, we wrote our setting's history, concentrating on our ancient empires. And this time, we're going to talk about what our maps communicate to our players, using what we learn to divide our continent into regions. Say you show your players a political map, meaning the borders on it denote which sovereign state controls what land. Of course, a map like this tells your players that your setting is a political one and that its political borders are important, but different political maps can communicate very different things. When picturing a non-Earth political map, your players are very likely to picture a map that looks like this. It is the current reality of the genre that the way many players, and many DMs for that matter, think about politics in fantasy is going to be influenced by Game of Thrones. Personally, I'm not really a Game of Thrones guy. I didn't love the show and I didn't read the books. It's really just not my cup of tea. But it is important to understand that George R.R. Martin's creation and its spin-offs are probably going to function as the preeminent tastemakers in the political fantasy microgenre, as well as politics in fantasy in general, for another decade or so. And before I continue, I am not a Game of Thrones lore expert. I am probably going to skate over a good deal of the setting's complexity, but that's not what the video is about, and more importantly, that's really not what the video is about. A political entity's claimed border does not always match up with the territory it can realistically control, defend, and administer law to, but taking this map at face value, I would consider this a politically evolved setting, meaning it has many large, organized, bureaucratically complex powers. This is clear due to its political borders all touching, meaning pretty much the entirety of the landmass is claimed by one of those powers, and there aren't large swaths of unclaimed, unincorporated wilderness. As opposed to political maps of my settings, which tend to look like this. Hey look, large swaths of unclaimed, unincorporated wilderness. Between the setting's centers of political power, at least from the perspective of the cartographer, there exist lawless lands, not governed by any organized political entity. This is what I would consider a politically devolved setting, and a little closer to what is assumed by the core books for baseline D&D. There are political entities, but they are not large or sophisticated enough to control country-sized pieces of the continent. If you show your players a political map, where you put your borders is going to tell them a lot. What if we showed them the biome map we made in step 2? A map like this communicates to your players that the most important delineations in your setting are the large-scale patterns in its natural landscape. This would fit perfectly into a politically devolved setting, where any travel from one region to another is going to include long treks through the wilderness. Each of these examples lends itself to a particular style of play, but as is true with every step of the world building process, the decisions you make now about your setting are not prohibitive. You can run a political intrigue adventure in a setting like this, and a wilderness survival adventure in a setting like this. And these are not your only two options. So far in the channel, the maps we've made have been perfectly accurate because we are using them to define our setting. But you could also choose to show your players the kind of map their characters might find in your world itself. If your setting is analogous to our world in 900 CE, like Praxis, it might be hard to find an accurate map of the continent. Say you were a 10th century inhabitant in Western Europe in search of a map of the known world. Your best bet would probably be Ptolemy's geography, which, while better than nothing, has a few pretty big inaccuracies. After all, by this time, it's almost 700 years old. There were more accurate maps out there, just not in Europe. Al-Khwarizmi gave the Islamic world an updated version of Ptolemy's map in 833, and Jiadan gave Tang Dynasty China this 30 by 33 foot masterpiece in 801. But these maps weren't available at the corner store. I mean, this one was a gift to the Emperor. Map making and map copying were time and skill intensive processes. Even if you could find an accurate map, or God forbid an atlas, it was going to be exorbitantly expensive. Though in a magical setting, you are well within your right to put your thumb on this particular scale. So you might decide to show your players a sketchier map, like one that might be available for purchase in one of your setting cities. For example, when running an Underdark adventure, my map looked like this. This is it with all of my notes removed. But the map my players purchased in town looked like this. A map like this will be very general. The farther you travel from its center, the more likely you are to reach unexplored and uncharted areas. It's also likely to have many "here there be dragonses," or regions that are largely unexplored because of some danger, marked with a textual note or illustration. These types of maps tell your players that they are in a very devolved setting, that there is a great deal of uncertainty in the world, and that if their journeys take them too far from charted civilization, they might be flying blind. This might also motivate them to seek out a more accurate map, like at the library or in the crypt of an ancient cartographer. Oh, that actually sounds pretty fun. You might also decide to get a bit more creative with your map. This is a Mappa Mundi. These were medieval European maps which often prioritized religious and supernatural symbolism over cartographic accuracy. In D&D terms, a lot of them look pretty close to what we would call a cosmology. A map like this would be right at home in a mythic fantasy setting. It tells your players that the lines in your world are a bit blurry, that if they sail too far, they could find themselves in the plane of water. And if they need to go to the higher planes, they very well may find themselves climbing the world tree. There are more types of maps than those I've mentioned, and while making your own, you are free to mix and match elements from each. It's time to use what we've learned to make our regional map. Regional maps cut our continent into a few smaller, more easily digestible pieces. In most low-level adventures, your players will not be traveling far enough for a map of this scale to be useful for tracking their movement, but it is still a very useful map, for them and for you. And that's because it helps you give them the feeling that the world around their characters is big and alive and full of wonder. Let's say your players are in a fishing village, investigating a disappearance, and during their rooting around they find a vial of an unknown substance. After a few ability checks and a trip to the local herbalist, they correctly identify it. The herbalist could tell them that it is powdered dragon glass, a rare substance from a faraway place, and a strange thing to have found in a poor fishing village, which would all be true. Or they could tell the PCs that it is powdered dragon glass, collected from the crystal dunes of the Sabak Desert. When confronted with the name of a place they don't recognize, your players will likely check their maps. After a glance at your setting's regional map, one of your players might say, "Wow, the Sabak Desert is like 1,000 miles away. What is this doing here?" You are giving them the same information, but you're letting them take the final step. How and how often to implement lore like this is something I've spoken about at length before, but being able to mention the name of a place, which your players can then find on a map which they already had, is a very powerful tool in your DM toolbelt. Regional divisions on your map can also allow for a good deal of variance in the tone and flavor of your adventures. Even though we've already decided on the magic level and weirdness level of our setting as a whole, that doesn't mean we don't have any wiggle room. Since we are keeping praxis simple and along the lines of what is considered baseline D&D, I can tell you right now that our first adventure will take place in a temperate forest, littered with small hamlets. There will be goblins, dragons, a wizened sage in a tower, and a big bad evil guy in search of a powerful artifact. You know, the classics. But say sometime down the line, we want to branch out and run an adventure with a different feel, or a different flavor of fantasy. Setting that adventure in a different region which has a different normal can be a great way to do that. For example, you can unevenly distribute magic levels between different regions. Maybe the area where you run your first adventure is above a ley line, or next to a tear in the weave, giving it a relatively high magic level. Your next adventure could have a much lower magic level, because it takes place directly over the Goddess of Magic's eternal prison, which casts an anti-magic field 100 miles in every direction. Or say you want to transition your high medieval fantasy game into one with a more grimdark tone. Your PCs could find themselves in a new region, a wretched wasteland desecrated by an Empyrean's corpse, which has been rotting for 100 millennia. Regional boundaries give us easy avenues towards running adventures with a wide variety of tones, all within the same world. All of that said, and as fun as it is to come up with that stuff, I think it's pretty important at this stage to not overwrite. In all regions, except the one your first adventure takes place in, the region's name, a notable geographic feature, and a quick description of its capital city is all we are going to build at this stage. Not only are we leaving ourselves plenty of room for future ideas, we are also being efficient with our time. Provided your goal is to run a game, you don't want to delay your first session just to flesh out a place 1,000 miles away from where your adventure starts. These few things are going to give us plenty of dragon glass and crystal dunes to put in front of our players. And don't worry about your players running out of stuff to explore. Speaking from experience, you can get years of gameplay from a single one of these regions. You can get years of gameplay from a single city if you really want to. So, where are we drawing our regional borders? If your setting is politically evolved, it is completely reasonable for your regional map to be divided along its political borders. Seeing as, in a region with many competing centralized powers, these lines will often function as the most important boundaries in the setting. But if your world is more in line with the median D&D setting, only drawing lines around political borders might leave your map looking a little sparse. In this case, you might decide to use the natural borders in your setting to designate its regions. It should be noted that many political borders match up with natural thresholds in the landscape, especially when it comes to how difficult terrain is to traverse. Many borders in our world, even today, are situated along geographic features which are difficult or dangerous to cross. So it's entirely possible that some of the political borders in your setting match up with its natural divisions. It's also possible that your regional map doesn't contain any borders at all. A rather popular style of map, especially one for fantasy settings, is this kind of geopolitical map. Even though the area's regions are clearly labeled, there aren't defined borders between them. This fuzziness, along with the inclusion of the realm's capital cities, paints the picture of a setting somewhere pretty close to that baseline D&D I'm always talking about. Our regional map for Praxis is going to be something between our first two examples. Something pretty close to this, but with defined borders. If you recall, in episode 3, we wrote our setting's history, including some ancient, politically complex empires. And we want our map to communicate that the echoes of these empires are still being heard in our world today. Large political entities like these have a tendency of building physical borders, like walls or networks of frontier fortifications. Some of these constructions were more symbolic than functional, like a line of rocks or a small mound, just to let everyone know that, hey, if you cross this, you're in our territory. But if you draw a line on the surface of a planet, people tend to treat it as a border, whether or not they are associated with or even know about the people who drew it. So Praxis was politically complex in the past, but isn't anymore, and our regional map is going to communicate this. A few of the divisions between our regions are going to pretty closely line up with our ancient empire's borders, especially those which were accompanied by walls, rivers, or any other physical thing which still exists on the planet's surface. But because Praxis is currently a politically devolved setting, many of its regional borders are going to be where the natural world changes. In other words, along our biome borders or around difficult to traverse terrain. This kind of hybridized map communicates that Praxis is a continent with the memory of once great empires, but is now covered in wilderness. I've found that a total of around 8 regions is a pretty good number. That way our players can see that there are several places very different to their current location while not being overwhelmed. As far as naming our regions, we're going to use something pretty similar to the process we use to name our empires. deciding which of our naming languages makes sense for each region, coming up with a base word, and then monkeying around with it until it is a toponym which still fits into that language's phonology. Now is also a good time to start thinking about adventures. The farther we get into the process, the blurrier the lines between world building and adventure design get. It is my opinion that if you haven't already, now is a pretty good time to start thinking about the adventures you want to run in your setting. You don't have to commit to anything, but if there is a central tension or thematic question which you want to be present across more than one of your adventures, I would have it in the back of your mind going forward. If these terms don't mean anything to you, don't panic. We'll get there. It is my intention, when this series is over, to follow it with one of a similar format, wherein we use the world we've built to write an adventure. I know this episode was more yapping than building, and if what you want is a voiceover while I draw maps and fill out the OneNote, there will be plenty of that in episode 4.2, where we design our setting's capital cities. But now for a bit more yapping, this time about the channel itself. The support for the misconception video was amazing and humbling and incredibly appreciated. So first off, I wanted to say thank you. Second, the success of the last video has pushed my channel past the threshold of monetization. I'm trying to become more educated on this whole ecosystem, but I am pretty out of my element here. So if pressing the monetize button has increased the ads on my videos to the point of it being unbearable, let me know and I'll fix it. And finally, I was thinking about starting a Patreon. My thought was to completely rip off Technology Connections and have a $1 baseline, which would give you access to the videos before they're on YouTube, and then maybe 2 tiers above that if you just really want to support the channel. And that's it. Thank you so much for the support. It's been fantastic. If you want to continue to support me, you can do all that normal stuff down at the bottom of the screen. And that's it. See you. This is a Mappa Mundi. These were medieval